So Scouts, pay attention. Next year when it's time to sell popcorn and Girl Scout cookies, you know who to go to, all right? So, the scripture lesson for this morning, the one from the Gospel of Luke. Does it seem weird to anyone else that John the Baptist isn't sure about whether or not Jesus is the Messiah? Am I the only one that seems odd to? It looks like I am the only one that seems odd to. Raise your hand if you thought that was a little weird. Yeah, it's odd, isn't it? And there's actually a lot of theories out there about how it is that John comes to ask this question through his disciples to Jesus. Are you the one to come, or are we to wait for another? It's really interesting. This story about John and Jesus and the disciples, it only occurs in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Luke. Now, it's exceptionally odd in the Gospel of Matthew why John asks whether or not Jesus is the one. Most people chalk it up to doubt, and it's really odd though because in the Gospel of Matthew, we don't know too much about John until he appears in the wilderness. You know, he appears preaching, proclaiming, and baptizing folks. That's how John sort of comes onto the scene in the Gospel of Matthew. And then Jesus comes to hear John as well. And Jesus goes to be baptized by John. And John says, "Oh no, I'm not worthy to baptize you." And Jesus corrects him and says, "Yes, you are the one to baptize me." And so he baptizes Jesus. And when Jesus comes up out of the water, the Holy Spirit, like a dove, descends upon Jesus. And a voice from heaven says, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." So John has experienced all of that firsthand, and yet still he asks, "Are you the one to come, or are we to wait for another?" But there's sort of an extenuating circumstance. In the Gospel of Matthew, when John asks this, John is in prison. He has been arrested by Herod, and he is in a cell. He is both literally and figuratively in a very dark place. And so, just being human, it would make sense that John doubts what he knows about Jesus as the Messiah. In the Gospel of Luke, though, the passage that we had today, it's a little bit different. So John, in the Gospel of Luke, takes on a very prominent role. He's very important. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, the miraculous conception of John by his mother Elizabeth, that's the first story we have in Luke. The story about Mary's miraculous conception of Jesus comes later. John is primary. And then when Mary is pregnant, she goes to visit her pregnant cousin Elizabeth. And Elizabeth says, "The child in my womb," who's become John the Baptizer, "leapt at the presence of the child in your womb, Jesus." We know from the beginning that these are two incredibly important people in the Gospel of Luke. But that's as close as they ever get to meeting in the Gospel of Luke. Did you know that? If you read the Gospel of Luke, we find out that when we meet John and he is doing that preaching and proclaiming and baptizing, Jesus doesn't come down there while he's doing that. And in fact, in the Gospel of Luke, we find out that when Jesus is baptized, John has already been arrested and put into prison. So in the Gospel of Luke, it seems like Jesus is baptized after John. So it would make sense then, if John has never really come into contact with Jesus, that while he is in prison, that he asks, "Are you the one to come, or are we to wait for another?" It's interesting that this happens because John, actually, in the world outside of Scripture, the historical records from the time that we don't have in the Bible, John actually seems to be a more significant and important person in the world than Jesus. In fact, it seems that John is the one that the Romans were concerned about, mostly. John is the one that they thought would lead the rebellion and the revolt against the empire. And so in the writings of the time, John takes on a much more prominent role. So one theory about this is that this whole interaction with John, his disciples, and Jesus is a way of John explaining to his disciples that he's not who is most important. That it is Jesus who is most important. That this is a way for John to communicate to his disciples that Jesus is the one he has been talking about all along. So there's just a couple of theories right there. One is that John is having a moment of doubt because he's in a very dark place. The other is while he is in that dark place, in that prison, knowing that that is where he's going to end up, he needs to make sure that his disciples know the authority of the one who is Jesus, the Messiah. So there's a couple of theories, and there are a lot more. If you'd have been in Sunday school this morning with Wendy, you would have heard a lot more of the theories about why it is that John had to ask this question. For my 2 cents, I wonder if it's because Jesus just isn't the Messiah John expected him to be. And that was something that they talked about in Sunday school as well. But what if Jesus just wasn't the Messiah that John expected him to be? If you remember when John first started preaching about the one who is to come, he said things about Jesus. He said that the one who is to come will baptize with the Holy Spirit. The winnowing fork is in his hand, separating the wheat from the chaff, and the chaff will be burned with unquenchable fire. Well, at the beginning of this passage, John's disciples have come to tell John all that Jesus has been doing. And if we read through the first part of the Gospel of Luke, here's what we find out that Jesus has been doing. After his baptism, he goes into the wilderness where he is tempted by the devil. He comes out of the wilderness, out of the temptation, and he begins to preach in his home synagogue and in many other places. He begins to heal people. He begins to proclaim good news to the poor. He even brings the dead to life. These are amazing and miraculous things. But they're not what John said the Messiah was going to be doing. Right? I mean, there's no baptism that Jesus is doing there. There's no unquenchable fire that seems to be going on. Now, it could be that John was speaking figuratively instead of literally. She agrees with me on that one. It could be that John was just speaking in kind of broad prophetic terms. But even if he was, those words, baptizing with the Holy Spirit, unquenchable fire, it creates this image that we have of someone who is coming with authority and with might, who kicks in the door of the world and announces himself with full authority and power and presence. And that's just not who Jesus is. It seems like John has some preconceived notions about who he thought the Messiah was going to be. And it seems like Jesus wasn't fitting into those preconceived notions. Now, I kind of like this theory, because this whole passage to me seems to be about straightening out preconceived notions. It starts with Jesus trying to straighten out John and John's disciples' preconceived notions about him. They come to Jesus and say, are you the one? Are we to wait for another? And here's what's really amazing to me, and it was obviously amazing to Wendy too, because she brought it up in Sunday school. Jesus could have very easily said yes or no, right? Jesus could have said, yes, I am the one. No, I'm not the one. Either of those answers Jesus could have said, but instead of making it a simple answer, he says, go and tell John what you have seen and what you hear. The blind receive sight, the deaf hear, the mute can speak, the lame can walk, the poor have good news proclaimed to them, and even the dead are raised. Jesus doesn't tell them yes or no. He just tells them who he is. He explains to them, clarifies for them who he is by what he has been doing. And I think that this whole passage is about clarifying who he is, because clarity seems to be very important for Jesus here. Because not only does he clarify who he is, he goes on to clarify who John is. You know, presumably the people who were there that day had also gone to hear John. He was speaking and preaching and proclaiming out in the wilderness, because Jesus says to them, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? I mean, what did you expect? Did you go out there just to see the reeds growing wild on the riverbanks? Did you expect to see some rich person out there? No. You went out into the wilderness to listen to John, to see John, to hear a prophet. And not just any prophet, Jesus says, but the prophet. The one who is talking about the one who is coming. The one who is preparing the way. The prophet. You went out into the wilderness to hear the prophet. It's as though Jesus is saying to them, you went out into the wilderness because somewhere, deep down, you wanted to hear and you wanted to see something with more substance. You needed to hear and you needed to see that something else was going on than just the world that was around you. I mean, the world that's around them is crazy, right? Because as Jesus says, John came, ate no bread and drank no wine, and you declared him to be a demon. The Son of Man comes eating and drinking, and he's a glutton and a drunkard. There's no win. The world is crazy, but you, Jesus said, you have come out to hear and to believe that there is more. To hear and to believe that God is doing something in the world. It's as though when Jesus clarifies for the people who he is and who John is, it clarifies for the people who they are as well. Now, all of this clarity about identity comes up because John asks a question. And that question comes out of the place where he is in prison. As we mentioned before, he is literally and figuratively in a dark place. I started reading this past week a book by Barbara Brown Taylor called Learning to Walk in the Dark. And in this book, she talks about how traditionally we view the dark as bad and the light as good. Now, this rang a bell for me as someone who used to be afraid of the dark. That might ring a bell for some of you who used to be afraid of the dark, or some of us who are still from time to time afraid of the dark. She says that in Christianity, we tend to see things as dark and light. The dark is bad, the light is good. And we do a really good job of dealing with the light, but we don't always do a good job of dealing with the dark. And she goes on to suggest that maybe the reason we don't do a good job of dealing with the dark is because we see it as bad, and we would rather avoid that which is bad. But she goes on to suggest that those moments in the dark, they're not all bad, just as those moments in the light are not all good. John is in a dark place. And whatever his motivation, in that dark place, he asked a question. And from that question, he learned who Jesus is. He learned who the Messiah is. And his disciples then learned, go and tell. Go and tell what you have seen and what you have heard. Go and tell who Jesus is that you have experienced. Whether you are in a light place or a dark place, Jesus is there. That experience is real. We are to go and tell.